Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. And today's video is going to be an addendum to the video I did recently about Oral Torah and the Ethiopian Jewish community. Now, the question I answered in the last question is whether or not, according to as some people claim, that the Ethiopian Jewish community didn't have an Oral Torah. And in the last video, I dealt with basically answering that question. So this one will be a continuation of some additional things I found. Now, again, in order to understand what was talked about in the last video, as well as all these videos I did about Oral Torah, is that you have to understand what the word actually means. And, not to dig too deep into it, because if you've seen my other videos, you've seen this description that essentially when you deal with the definition of the word Torah in Hebrew, some people pretend or try to treat it as if the word means written text. When in reality, the three-letter root word that, ancient Hebrew worked on three-letter roots, and the three-letter root the word Torah comes from is Yud Resh He, which you see here, which has the meaning of to cast or shoot, which usually associates with either shooting an arrow or hitting a target. And essentially, when you deal with the conjugation of the word, the verbal form that you get into that denotes the word Torah, it comes from the he filled form of the verb, which would basically mean hora, to instruct, to teach. Gives the meaning of the word Torah as instruction, direction, precept, or even law, mode, or manner. Now, again, these are attempts to translate this word into English. So this is not like, for example, something that's like set in stone in the way that people usually understand it, but this is a translation, attempt of taking the meaning of one language, this here, Torah, and putting it into, the English language, for example. Now, what's important here is that there's nothing in the word itself that notes that this is something that has to be written. That is just simply any type of instruction, direction, precept, law, mode, or manner. Anything. So if it's oral, then it's oral. If it's written, it's written. So then that gives us the reality, first of all, to say that when someone says oral Torah, Torah Shabbat Peh, what they're essentially saying is that this is an oral instruction. So then the question becomes whether or not the instruction being talked about is something that, for example, is an oral instruction that came from Mount Sinai, from the giving of the Torah, by Hashem, or something that comes from a different generation but is, concerning an issue of Torah. So as I mentioned before, the author of the book that I used in the last video, and I'll be using in this video to analyze whether or not Ethiopian Jews have an oral Torah, is Rabbi Sharon Shalom. Now, he wrote this book here, which is in Hebrew called Misinai Ethiopia, and essentially it's been translated into English. And what I'll be using in this video is like sections of the English translation, just for the sake of time. But just to revamp rehash something that I mentioned in the last video, I met him personally, probably around 2005, 2006, when he visited New York. It was at a dinner I was at with a few friends of mine who were from the Ethiopian Jewish community. And during that time, he actually spoke at that dinner about the idea that he had about writing this book. This book, I think he wrote this like several years ago, but this is like, at least I would say maybe like 10 or 15 years before he actually wrote this book. And one of the ideas he had mentioned during that time was one of the challenges the Ethiopian Jews have in coming to Israel is that they had certain halacha or certain traditions that were different from other Jewish communities because of their isolation in Ethiopia. And because of the fact that they also didn't have the Hebrew language. They had like a language they used called Gez, and which is an ancient Ethiopian language. So, for example, they didn't have a Hebrew Tanakh, a Hebrew like text, things like that. So he discussed this idea of writing this book, which he considered to be like a Shulchan Aruch for the Ethiopian Jewish community, meaning a book that deals with halakha. And I was glad to see that, one day when I saw that he had actually written this book and finished it. So that's an important note to know that his idea was to try to basically encompass what was considered to be the oral Torah of the Ethiopian Jewish community, the halakha of the Ethiopian Jewish community, the minhagim, the traditions of the Ethiopian Jewish community, and try to relate to, the generations from the ones who were in Ethiopia to the generations of those who live in Israel, and try to like make a common ground so that they could, exist within modern Israeli society, as long as with communities that, for example, basically have a different structure in terms of halakha and things like that. So let's get into what he exactly mentions on this issue, which I feel is relevant to the question that some people had specifically that a missionary brought up recently about claiming that, there must not be an oral Torah because the Ethiopian Jews didn't have one. So let's look into that a little bit further. So when we look on page 97 of his book, and that's page 97 within the Hebrew text. I don't know where it is in the English, but this is from Sifriya.com. So essentially, he deals with the issue of what's called the halacha of Ethiopian Jewry then and now. So one of the things he mentions in this, that, his idea of writing this book, for example, where he mentions this. And again, it's a little bit worded a little bit differently in Hebrew. And I'll kind of talk about like what words are used in Hebrew, which gives a better classification sometimes than the English. But he gives like, several issues about, his need to write this book. And this is some of the things I mentioned. So one of the things I want to point out is this line here, where he says the goal of this work is to collect the customs of the Beta Israel community. Beta Israel is the proper term that's used to describe the Ethiopian Jewish community that maintained its traditions as Jews in the land of Ethiopia without converting to Christianity by force and things like that. And he says, the goal of this work is to collect the customs of the Beit Israel community and to preserve customs that were transmitted orally. Okay, so we've had a clear designation here that he's saying that they had traditions or customs that were transmitted orally. And I believe the Hebrew that, I took a look at the book again as I left it at home, is that he talks about them having Masorah. Masorah also denotes the idea of having an oral transmission. He basically goes on and says, okay, that going to this line here, where I highlight, he says one of the other goals he had with his book was to show the connection between the different customs that he gives as the Talmudic halakha alongside the Ethiopian custom. So this is one of the things he's saying that what he basically one of the goals he had with his book was to show, okay, here's the Ethiopian custom, here's alongside it, for example, the Talmudic, traditions. And when we use the word Talmudic in this context, what he uses in Hebrew, for example, the Hebrew text is more clear, is that what he's saying is this, that the Ethiopian Jewish community was separated from the majority of the Jewish people who either were in the land of Israel at a certain point, or, for example, were in the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and things like that, but that the Ethiopian Jewish community had no connection with. And essentially, the point he's making is that as the Jews who returned back from the Babylonian and Assyrian exile came back to the land of Israel, around the Second Temple period, the basic you could say halakha that was developed, during those times, which was a progression of the halakha that existed beforehand, something that his community didn't have because they had no connection to those communities. So, for example, when you look in the Talmud tells you how halakha developed, from the time of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai all the way into the Second Temple period to the time that the Mishnah was compiled and then the Talmud was compiled. But there's not really a claim that like every little thing in the Talmud goes back to Mount Sinai. It's just a matter of this is the development of those things. So what he says is that, okay, look, there's a connection between what existed, in what exists in the Talmud and Ethiopian Jewish custom, and also what was before, certain elements of the Talmud came online, and that's the basic reality, a historical reality that he deals with in this book. So then going to page 293 in the Hebrew book, he says the following concerns the laws of forbidden foods, Ethiopian halakha. So he says, and I'll read from the start. The Jews of Ethiopia were very careful in their observance of the laws of kosher foods. And he says they learned these laws from the Torah and from the oral tradition, which, basically he mentions like in the Hebrew text that this is the al peh, masorat al peh. For example, I think that's the way he mentions it. But he specifically uses the terminology that is, oral Torah. So when he says oral tradition in English, what he's talking about is an oral Torah, their version of it, for example. He says they were extremely careful not to eat meat from non-kosher animals. They did not even touch these animals. And one who touched a non-kosher animal was considered impure and remained outside the village until he or she could immerse in the river. Now, what's important is that he mentions immersing in a river. The written Torah in Hebrew never mentions immersing in a river, but this is something that was the oral Torah, the oral tradition that they had about how to take care of those issues. He continues and says, Avraham Yardai notes that it was absolutely forbidden to touch a nevilah, the carcass of a kosher animal not killed in accordance with Jewish law and therefore forbidden for consumption. It was not forbidden to touch a dead animal that was not kosher, but if one stepped on the, basically the, feces of a carnivore, it was customary to immerse oneself. He further says, what I highlight here is slaughtering of kosher animals was performed by the cutting the animal's neck, which is done in, Jewish custom based on the Talmud. And they were careful that during slaughter, the animal's head was pointed towards Jerusalem. Again, these are things that are not mentioned in the written Torah. And these are things that are actually from the oral Torah that also are found in Jewish communities that held by the Talmud, for example. He continues on page 293 and says the kes or other experienced person performed the slaughter. Now, the kes, just for those who don't know, is a title basically given to the leaders of the Ethiopian Jewish community. And it was from them that the written Torah and the oral Torah was basically taught to the Jewish community of Ethiopia. For example, there was no such thing as every individual Ethiopian like saying, okay, well, the written Torah says this, I'll determine for myself what it means. No, that came from the kes. The kes, or base essentially, if you want to use a Jewish word for it, not a Jewish word, I should say like a Hebrew and Aramaic word for it, Saying a kes is no different than saying a rabbi. The kes is just simply the title for someone who was Ethiopian, and it was from the kes that you went to get all your answers about the Tanakh and the Torah from their community. So he says the kes, another experienced person, performed the slaughter, the shechita, meaning of the animal. In fact, between the written Torah, because the written Torah does not define the exact method of slaughter, the custom in Ethiopia was that the head of every observant family slaughtered for his family. So essentially, this means that he would have to be the one to know exactly what to do. So it had to be an experienced person. Where do you get this experience from? If, as the example where he says that the written Torah does not define the exact method, this came from their oral Torah. So then if we go to page 294, where he talks about Nikur, he says the following, Ethiopian halacha. And remember, notice how he uses halacha over and over again. Because if this is not like oral Torah from their perspective, he wouldn't use the word halacha here. He could just say, well, Ethiopian, practice, and just simply quote where the Torah says what to do and be left at that. He says the usual practice is to conduct the slaughtering as a group. Afterwards, two or three people remove the parts that are not eaten. Some families do not eat the heart. According to the testimony of Kes Menatatzot, Eli Wende, and Avraham Yarai, they removed the Gid HaNashem, the sciatic nerve, and disposed of it. Some parts of the Halev, which is the certain fat, were forbidden, while other parts were permitted. And this is something that's also an element of the oral Torah because the written Torah never identifies how you would, never gives you a way to identify what this halev is, the actual fat is. So you'd have to have an oral Torah to know where it is and what fat is acceptable, what permissible for the regular Jew to eat and what is not. So then he says, according to the Kes, the difference between the Talmudic halacha and the Ethiopian halacha on this issue was not significant. Meaning that if you look in Talmudic halacha and compare to Ethiopian halacha, they're virtually almost the same. So this tells you something when he makes this statement, that the Talmud Halacha didn't just come out of nowhere, and that it did exist if the Ethiopian Jews have something similar to it. So essentially, what we can say based on what we've said earlier is that if I were to try to take, all these communities that already agree upon the Torah Moshe of the national revelation at Mount Sinai, the written Torah and the sources of oral Torah, meaning if I take all of them and together they make up the majority of Torah-based Jews, and then I add in Ethiopians, I see that there's not a lot of difference between the two, and I can understand because of the exile that they were, if you will, like separated more than everyone else, and that once they came to Israel, and this was one of the goals of the book, there had to be kind of like an evaluation of how do you integrate them into the society of all these different communities that already had this information without separation. And essentially what happened was, and this is what Rabbi Shalom had mentioned, the author of the book we just looked at, he had said that, more than likely what Ethiopian Jews should do, and he mentions this in his book, is, try to maintain whatever, traditions they had that are compatible with living in the land of Israel, not being in exile in Ethiopia, and then learn the Talmud and things like that of the things that happened when they were not around. But he never comes out and says, well, the Talmud's wrong and, this stuff didn't exist. He simply says that this was a development that happened when we weren't around. The rulings that were made during the Second Temple period by the Sanhedrin or the Mosaic court, they weren't there for those things. So those are things that they wouldn't have had because they weren't there for those rulings. But everything before that time that they were able to maintain, they did as best they could in exile, but then they lost a lot of things. The Hebrew language is one of the things that they lost. And this gets away from this whole issue of, trying to debate what exactly the background is. I mean, they're Jews, and that's about all that I personally ever really worry about. And then it's just simply a matter of how do the Torah-based Jewish communities reintegrate. So this, again, goes against what was being taught by certain missionaries. When they say, well, the Ethiopian Jews didn't have an oral Torah, so therefore there wasn't one. This shows you that they're completely wrong in that. And I would even venture to say that most of the time when you hear missionaries talk about this, they have no connection to the Ethiopian Israeli/Jewish community, the Beit Yisrael themselves personally. They simply look for things to say that the Jewish community is evil or bad or the rabbis are bad, and then they try to use those points without any real connection to them. So this is the end of this video, and I have another video coming up about some other issues concerning oral Torah. Thank you and bye.